What a rotten deal we made with Iran. We get nothing, except laughter at our stupidity. They get everything, including delay and big cash. That was how, in 2013, a well-known New York real estate developer attacked the interim nuclear agreement reached with Iran by Barack Obama's administration. More than a decade later, the same man, now President of the United States, has negotiated his own deal with Tehran. And given Trump's relentless criticism of Obama and the hard line on Iran he has projected since his first term, the content of the memorandum he himself signed with Tehran may come as a shock. The immediate lifting of sanctions on Iranian oil exports, $300 billion for an Iranian reconstruction fund, and recognition of Iran's privileged position in the Strait of Hormuz. These are only some of the provisions included in the agreement signed by President Trump. But while Tehran's victory may now seem within reach, in practice it may still be far away. The document that was signed is only a memorandum, one that freezes the crisis for 60 days. Further negotiations are supposed to continue in the background. Only those talks are meant to produce the final agreement between the United States and Iran. Opponents of the deal will almost certainly do everything they can not only to derail the talks, but also to restart the fighting. At the head of that camp stands, of course, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to use the escalation of the war in Lebanon to block any agreement with Iran. So is the American-Iranian Memorandum, in effect, an American capitulation? Let's find out. Versailles, Trump and Pezeshkian signatures. The Strait of Hormuz reopened to shipping. The memorandum heralding the end of the US-Iran war was announced in just a few days, though its final shape is still in question even among White House officials. Events like these can hit your portfolio faster than you would expect. I have been trying to respond to these shifts deliberately for years, rather than wait to be caught off guard, which is exactly why I use XTB, the partner of this channel and the place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives me access to over 12,000 instruments from around the world, along with up-to-date market news and expert analysis, all in one convenient app. Thanks to this, I'm not just observing the market, but reacting to events as they unfold, not after they make headlines. Because in today's environment, being prepared is not an advantage, it is a necessity. Just remember that every investment involves risk. Initially, the American-Iranian Memorandum was supposed to be signed in Geneva. In the end, however, it was signed remotely, in electronic form. On the Iranian side, it was signed by President Masoud Pezeshkian, on the American side by President Donald Trump. Trump, who was in Europe at the time for the G7 summit, signed his copy at the Palace of Versailles. And as one might expect, the symbolism of that location was not lost on the president's critics. The memorandum contains 14 points. Let's look at them closely. The first point introduces an immediate and permanent end to military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon. The explicit mention of Lebanon was the result of pressure from Iran, which, acting within its so-called unity of front strategy, refused to accept an agreement that would leave Hezbollah at the mercy of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli military. The third point commits the United States and Iran to working out the terms of a final agreement within 60 days. That deadline, however, may be extended by mutual consent. Under point 4, immediately after the signing of the memorandum, the United States is to begin lifting the naval blockade imposed on Iran. The blockade is to be fully removed within 30 days. In addition, Washington has committed to withdrawing its armed forces from Iran's immediate vicinity within 30 days of the final agreement being signed. Point 5 of the memorandum is crucial for the Strait of Hormuz. It requires Iran to immediately open the strait and guarantee free passage for commercial vessels. But the devil is in the details. Point 5 states explicitly that transit through the strait is to remain free of charge only for 60 days. At the same time, it recognizes Iran's privileged position in the Strait of Hormuz and gives Tehran a green light to define the future framework for managing it, although the text stresses that this is to be done in dialogue with Oman and in agreement with the Arab states. Iran's determination to push for this new regime in the Strait is already visible in practice. Back in May, Tehran established the so-called Persian Gulf Strait Authority. Immediately after the memorandum was signed, the body issued a special statement emphasizing that transit through the Strait of Hormuz would be free only for 60 days, and that every vessel crossing the strait should be reported to Iranian authorities 48 hours in advance. For now, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains limited. On Thursday, June 18th, one day after the memorandum was signed, 25 commercial vessels passed through the strait. By Saturday, that number had risen to 55. But only a few hours later, Iran announced that it was closing the strait again because of the situation in Lebanon, a point we will return to shortly. To understand the scale of the disruption, it is worth remembering that before the war, roughly 130 vessels passed through the strait every day. We may not return to that level anytime soon. That is not only because of the actions of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, but also because of the mines Iran laid in the strait during the war. Under the memorandum, Iran has 30 days to clear Hormuz of mines, but experts warn that the operation could take much longer and may require assistance from Britain, France and Germany, which possesses the necessary naval assets and valuable experience in this kind of mission. And beyond that, there is the issue of ship owners and issuers, many of whom remain skeptical about the durability of the US-Iran agreement. But let's return to the text of the memorandum, because this is not the end of the concessions to Tehran. Under point 6, the United States commits to creating, together with regional partners, a special reconstruction fund for the Islamic Republic of Iran worth at least $300 billion. The details of that fund are to be defined in the final agreement. Under point 7, Washington commits to lifting all sanctions imposed on Iran. The exact timetable for sanctions relief is to be part of the final deal. And it is not only American sanctions that are to be removed, but also UN sanctions. At the same time, under point 10, the United States is already expected to issue special sanctions waivers in exchange for Iran's signature on the memorandum alone. These waivers will allow Iranian oil exports to resume legally. In itself, this will not change the amount of oil on the market, but will allow Tehran to sell its crude beyond China, which has been willing to buy Iranian oil but at heavily discounted prices. Equally important, the waivers are also expected to cover Iran's banking, insurance and transport sectors. Under point 11, the United States has agreed to release frozen Iranian assets, estimated at around $100 billion. This is supposed to happen after the memorandum is implemented, so it will almost certainly be done gradually, in tranches. Some Iranian assets have already been released. The United Arab Emirates reportedly unfroze assets worth $3 billion, while Qatar is expected to release another $6 billion. So, as we can see, the agreement contains a long list of concessions to Iran. The benefits for America are far more modest. Apart from reopening the Strait of Hormuz, Washington appears to have secured only limited commitments from Tehran regarding Iran's nuclear program. And even here the language is highly favorable to Iranians. Iran does commit not to build nuclear weapons, and it will have to make concessions regarding its stockpiles of enriched uranium, at the very least agreeing to dilute the material, something Tehran itself had already proposed back in March. But at the same time, the memorandum refers to the nuclear needs of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which suggests that, at least at this stage, Washington may have accepted the continuation of Iran's civilian nuclear program. The memorandum does not impose a direct ban on uranium enrichment by Iran. Instead, it moves toward monitoring and controlling the Iranian nuclear program, much like the JCPOA, the very agreement Trump once hated, rather than dismantling it entirely. Reading the memorandum, it is hard not to conclude that its content is almost absurdly favorable to Iran. The concessions demanded of Tehran are limited, and where they do appear, they are written in a way that still benefits Tehran. The memorandum raises two uncomfortable questions. First, what was the point of the war President Trump launched against Iran in February? And second, what was the point of the entire anti-Iranian policy he had pursued since withdrawing from the JCPOA in 2018? It was Trump who withdrew from the JCPOA, the Obama-Iran nuclear deal, and launched the so-called maximum pressure campaign against Tehran, placing sanctions on virtually every sector of the Iranian economy. Back in 2018, Trump called the JCPOA the worst deal ever made because it regulated only Iran's nuclear program while ignoring Tehran's support for the groups of the Axis of Resistance and its ballistic missile program. Today, the same President Trump says that since other countries have ballistic missiles, taking them away from Iran would be unfair. Above all, the current memorandum heroically solves problems that did not even exist a few months ago. Problems created by the US-Israeli attack on Iran. Before February 28th, oil and gas flowed freely through the Strait of Hormuz, and global energy markets were facing oversupply. Now the world is going through the largest oil supply shock in history, one that has not pushed prices above $200 a barrel only because of the massive release of strategic reserves. But those reserves were slowly running out, just like Trump's time to end the war with Iran. The president himself effectively admitted this at the G7 summit, saying, quote, "I didn't want to see economic catastrophe. If you kept this going, that could have happened." So yes, President Trump's decision to go to war with Iran was a strategic mistake, and the memorandum he has now signed can clearly be described as a diplomatic victory for the Islamic Republic of Iran. But one thing should not be forgotten. With international agreements, there is often a long and difficult road between signature and full implementation. And that is also the case with this memorandum. Guys, two short announcements before we move on. First, Serhi, who translated GTBT Ukraine before enlisting in the Ukrainian Air Force, has set up a fundraiser to collect money for shelters for Ukraine's unmanned systems, helping keep them safe from Russian long-range drones. You can support the fundraiser via the link down below. Second, as you might already know, we continue publishing GTBT's short-format series called Essence. Basically, these are our episodes turned into 8 10-minute pills. And no, the voice actor is not AI. Pozdrawiam, Barney. Okay, let's move on. One of the biggest obstacles to the full implementation of the memorandum is Lebanon. To understand why, we need to go back to the beginning of the war with Iran. When the United States and Israel attacked Iran in February, Lebanon's Hezbollah joined the confrontation on Tehran's side. In response, the Israeli military crossed the Lebanese border and launched a ground offensive against Hezbollah. Soon after, it became clear that the IDF was seeking a lasting occupation of southern Lebanon and the creation of a buffer zone there, whose boundaries began to be marked by the so-called Yellow Line. The Israeli buffer zone extends roughly 10 kilometers into Lebanon. At the same time, Israeli units have been pushing even deeper toward the Litani River, more than 20 kilometers from the border. The creation of this buffer zone is no accident. The IDF had previously established similar zones in Gaza and Syria. This is part of a broader new Israeli strategy, creating buffer zones that can absorb the enemy's first blow and prevent a repeat of October 2023, when Hamas penetrated deep into Israeli territory. From the start of the war, Iran strongly supported Hezbollah and, invoking the so-called unity of fronts, declared that it would not accept any deal that excluded Lebanon. It was precisely because of Iranian pressure that the Lebanese issue was ultimately included in the memorandum. But that decision surprised the Israelis. They had hoped that even if President Trump eventually reached an agreement with Iran, the IDF would retain a free hand in Lebanon. Within hours of the memorandum being signed, Netanyahu tried to undermine it, arguing that it did not bind Israel and that the IDF would continue its operations inside Lebanon. Only after sharp warnings from Washington did the IDF announce a ceasefire. But several hours later, Netanyahu again poured fuel on the fire, declaring that despite the ceasefire, Israel would not leave southern Lebanon and would maintain its buffer zone there for as long as necessary. Netanyahu knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to use the escalation in Lebanon to derail the talks between the United States and Iran, and his actions are already producing results. On Saturday, June 20th, Iran announced that because of the situation in Lebanon, it would once again close the Strait of Hormuz. Inside President Trump's camp, frustration with Israel's behavior is visibly growing. The face of that frustration has become Vice President J.D. Vance, who responded to Israeli criticism by saying, among other things, that President is the only ally Israel still has, and that American taxpayers pay for 2/3 of the weapons protecting Israel. Vance also said, "You are a country of 9 million people. You can't just kill your way out of solving every single national security problem that you have." His comments immediately triggered speculation about whether a deeper crisis may now be brewing between Washington and Tel Aviv, and whether Trump's team may soon try to blame Israel for the failure of the war with Iran. Still, it is worth remembering that this is not the first case of tension between Trump and Netanyahu. At the beginning of Trump's second term, the two leaders had already clashed over Yemen and Syria, when Trump first reached a ceasefire with the Houthis and then met with President Ahmed al-Shara and normalized relations with Syria. Both decisions were taken against Israel's wishes. Neither produced a lasting rupture in relations. This time, however, may be different. Prime Minister Netanyahu is under enormous political pressure. His far-right coalition partners are demanding that he defy Trump and escalate in Lebanon. Itamar Ben-Gvir put it bluntly, "For every tear of an Israeli mother, 1,000 Lebanese mothers should cry. All of Lebanon should burn." The situation is further complicated by the elections due in October. Although Likud, Bibi's party, remains the favorite in the polls, the current coalition does not appear to have enough support to stay in power. The war with Iran, of which Netanyahu was the chief architect, has clearly damaged the prime minister's image. It has brought him no lasting success. And the memorandum signed by the Americans is favorable to Iran in almost every respect, while also undermining Israeli operations even on the Lebanese front. It cannot be ruled out that the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history, searching for a way to remain in power and block the agreement with Iran, will now pivot on Lebanon and try to demonstrate that he is capable of standing up to America. It is also worth noting that Iran will remain actively involved in the Lebanese file. Tehran will do everything it can not only to secure a lasting ceasefire, but also to force the withdrawal of all IDF units from Lebanon. Especially now that the Iranians can also see the American administration's growing frustration with its Israeli ally. So what comes next? The memorandum that has been signed does not permanently resolve the current crisis. The next 60 days, during which the Americans and Iranians are supposed to work out a final agreement, will almost certainly be a political roller coaster. And not only because of Israel, but also because of President Trump's own temperament. We saw this already last weekend, when during US-Iran talks in Switzerland, Trump again threatened Tehran with bombing if the Iranians did not accept all of his conditions. In the end, the first round of talks produced some progress. A high-level committee was established for further technical discussions on Iran's nuclear program, and a communication channel was created to avoid incidents around the safe passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. It is still unclear whether the memorandum already signed can be fully implemented, or whether a final agreement on Iran's nuclear program can be reached at all. Although both sides want a compromise, their visions of how this conflict should end remain sharply different. Washington and Tehran do not even agree on what has already been signed. For example, the memorandum states that Hormuz will remain open free of charge for only 60 days. Iran has taken this to mean that after that period, it will be able to charge fees for transit. Trump disagrees, writing angrily on Truth Social that Iran has no such right, and that if anyone is going to collect fees, it will be the United States. The Iranians will almost certainly use the Hormuz issue to pressure Washington into a final deal. We should expect periodic blockades of the strait and constant pressure from Tehran to recognize Iranian control over Hormuz, as well as Iran's right to charge transit fees. And that should not be surprising. Hormuz is the strongest card Iran currently holds. Tehran has to use it if it wants to survive. Because although the Islamic Republic has defended itself against American-Israeli aggression, its economy has been devastated by decades of sanctions and by a 40-day war with the United States and Israel. Iran needs sanctions relief and access to its frozen assets in order to begin rebuilding the country and recover its lost potential. If Iran fails to secure that, the future of the Islamic Republic will remain deeply uncertain. Even so, a resumption of fighting between the United States and Iran still seems unlikely. The Americans do still have military options they could, in theory, use against Iran, but on President Trump's side, there is no political will to use them, because the risks are simply too high. Examples of options rejected by the Trump administration include escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz with the US Navy, seizing parts of the Iranian coast, or taking control of Iranian islands located at the entrance of the Persian Gulf. The talks with Iran will be extremely difficult. Israel will try to sabotage them, and Trump's explosive temperament will not make the process any easier. Still, it seems that the American administration will ultimately seek a compromise with Tehran and a lasting end to the conflict. Because of Iran's weaponization of Hormuz, Washington cannot simply walk away from the talks this time and postpone the Iran issue until circumstances become more favorable to America. The Iranians are ready to keep blocking the strait, even at the cost of triggering a global crisis, if that is what it takes to force Washington into a deal favorable to Tehran. And the last thing Trump wants is to be remembered as the president who caused a global recession.